Hello, it's Adam from The Tudor Chest here. In addition to running The Tudor Chest, I'm also the co-director of Simply Tudor Tours, a historic tour company which I run alongside my colleague Dr. Sarah Morris, who many of you may know as the Tudor Travel Guide. Our first 2025 tour is now live for bookings. Titled Anne and Elizabeth, Mother, Daughter, Traitors, Queens, this incredible 8-day-long experience will take in many of the most significant historic sites in England, all with behind-the-scenes access, from Hampton Court Palace to Hatfield House, the Tower of London, and a 2-night overnight stay in Hever Castle. Featuring historians including Professor Simon Thurley, CBE, Dr. Elizabeth Norton and Illyri Lynn. To discover more on this and secure your place on one of our live tours, or to sign up to latest updates, just head to simplytudortours.com. Cynthia Hand is the co-author behind the fabulous My Lady Jane book series, which has now been adapted into a major television series by Prime Studios. I welcome Cynthia onto the podcast today for a discussion all about the story of My Lady Jane, how she came up with the idea, character choices, how and what the Ethian storyline came to be, and so on. Cynthia also shares some insight into the production of the TV show, including a chance meeting that she had with Anna Chancellor, who played the absolutely scene-stealing Lady Frances Grey. So buckle in for a fun and fascinating chat all about the bonkers world of My Lady Jane. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 52, My Lady Jane with author Cynthia Hand. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast, Cynthia Hand. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Very welcome. So we're here today to talk about your book, My Lady Jane, which has been made into an amazing Amazon Prime series of the same name. But before we get into a discussion about your story and how you came up with this fantastical bonkers tale, I just wanted to get sort of ask you a few get to know you questions just for people to get to know you a bit better. So could you provide me with a short intro into your background, so where you grew up and what you now do full time?
Okay, sure. I grew up in Idaho in the northwestern United States, and I tried to get away from there pretty quickly as I was growing up. So I studied writing and got an MFA in writing in Idaho, and then I went to Nebraska, which is even more backwoods than Idaho was, and got a PhD there. And then spent the next about 10 years in California teaching creative writing at Pepperdine University, which is in Malibu. And that's where I really started to write professionally. And I had an idea for a novel and started writing it. And then about, a quarter of the way through writing it, I asked myself, is this young adult novel sort of thing that's going on lately? And went out and read a bunch of young adult books, and I was like, yeah, I think it is, because I was writing a character who was a teenager, and I was just lucky enough to publish that book, and have been writing books for Harper Teen ever since. And that's how I got to where I am. And then I moved back to Idaho about 10 years ago. So I've been doing the professional writing thing for about 15 years now, and I also teach creative writing at the university. So
busy lady.
Yeah.
So was there a particular moment or sort of something from your childhood that sparked your passion for Tudor history, I guess? Was there something or was it just this story sort of came along?
No, I always loved Tudor history. I was fortunate enough when I was in high school to have an amazing teacher, and he offered a British history class in my high school, and I loved him. He was like so engaging, and just to listen to him talk about history, it was like he was just telling a series of stories. His name was Mr. Haroldson, and he was just an amazing teacher. And I took every class that he offered, but British history was definitely my favorite of those, and really just ate up any story that he had to tell about British history. And he told the story of the Tudors in a very interesting and engaging way. And I've always just sought out and eaten up any sort of stories about that. I, of course, read The Other Boleyn Girl, and like anything that seemed to like touch that part of history, I was always interested in reading it. And I have other little pockets of history I'm interested in, but I've always loved the Tudor era. So
A bit of a random question. If you could pick a single moment from history, you can sort of jump in a time travel machine and go back and witness, what would it be?
oh gosh. I really would love to see Queen Elizabeth on any given day. Just to like look at her, just to see what she was like. It'd be a little scary, I think, too. But
Yeah, I think she'd be
um,
formidable.
yeah, yeah. Anytime people ask me about like what would this person in history think about now, I'm like, I don't know. That's a terrifying question. Like, how strange our lives now are, would be to them, and how strange their lives would be to us, I think.
Oh,
But
totally. And I think it's a really important thing to also keep in mind is because I think historians in particular, and it's something I try and really avoid, but a lot of historians will attempt to sometimes psychoanalyze figures from the past. And you can't really, I just don't believe you can do that because these were people who lived in a world that was so, so different from ours that we can't really get inside the head of a Tudor and say that we can totally understand them or place modern codes of behavior onto them because it was a different world.
yeah, sure. Which is kind of ironic when we're talking about, My Lady Jane, and how it's trying to sort of tell a modern story in this old era, that is very different than now. But I think in real life, yeah, it would be very difficult to do that.
So you've just beautifully mentioned there we're here to have a discussion today about My Lady Jane, which is part of a book series that you've written, and as I say, has now been adapted into a major television show on Amazon Prime. So I have to start with a fairly obvious question: how did you come up with this? I mean, it's a fantastic story. It's wild. It's funny. It's very bombastic. So where did the idea come from?
Yeah, it's always a little bit of a mystery to me where the idea itself comes from. At the time, I was writing a very somber book about teen suicide. And and it was a book I'm enormously proud of, and it was probably maybe even my best book, but it was rough to go through the writing of that book. And when I finished writing it, I was like, I want to do something fun. I want to do something that's light, something that gives me joy, so that I can, like enjoy this process in a different way. And I had been kicking around this idea of writing a story about my Lady Jane, or Jane Grey, who was known as the 9 Days Queen in history. And I had also been sort of kicking around writing a story that was sort of Princess Bride-like.
Right.
I love Princess Bride. I loved the old movie Lady Hawk. And so I wanted to write something that was funny and fun. And I also wanted to write something with my friends. I had made two very close friends who were fellow authors for Harper Collins. And I was sort of looking for a project that we all might work on together. And Brody Ashton, who's one of my co-authors on the book, is just one of the funniest people you'll ever meet. She's just incredibly funny, and she writes humorous articles for the Salt Lake Tribune, and her writing is incredibly funny. And then Jody is a fantasy writer, and Jody Meadows is my other co-author, and I wanted to work on a book with her too. And so I wanted to come up with something that was a combination of me as the history buff of the three of us, and Brody, who's so funny, and Jody, who has such like fantastical leanings in her writing. So we wanted to come up with a funny historical romantic comedy. So, and that's where it came from.
Yeah, and as I said, I mean, I adore how at times bonkers it is. I just think it's brilliant that you really lean into the fun side of the things, and it's very much this is proper ripping up the rule book. But I'm curious, did you also set yourself parameters on things that you wouldn't change about history, or maybe, where magic only goes so far? Were there things that you kind of set out that you wouldn't cross, lines you wouldn't cross?
I wanted to stick with the basic chain of events for Jane Grey. I didn't want to go too far away from like just what happened to her, like her situation, her marriage, and then the way she was put on the throne. And then, to take that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but like, and then to take that and then kind of, the book is separated into two pieces. The first half of the book is called In Which We Revise a Bit of History. So we're really staying closer to the actual events as they happened in a bonkers way, but still those events are kind of the stepping stones, for the narrative there. And then at about halfway, then the part of the book is called In Which We Throw History Out the Window, where we take Jane Grey past where she lived in real life and are really able to do whatever. So in the first half of the book, I really wanted to keep it closer to the actual events and just try to like speak to the heart of who I thought the characters were. Again, like we were talking about, I don't think that my Jane Grey or the show's Jane Grey is, a perfect representation of who Jane Grey was, obviously. Like, I think they're very different in terms of like the people that they were and the characters that they would be. But like, the sort of strength at the heart of her and the intellect, that she had, and how she tried to use her intellect and navigate her world. I think that was very important to us to get right. And then what I love about writing about history is sneaking in all of these little real details that are small things that people probably won't notice from history unless you know a lot more about it, that there are just little things here and there that we love to sneak in. And we actually did go to England, and we went to Bradgate Park, and we went to Dudley Castle, which is now like a zoo. It's the strangest thing. And we really tried to fit in a lot of those little details about the places and about the people, just because we like the history and want to like pull it in as much as we can.
For anyone who hasn't read the books or may have not watched the television series, can you introduce My Lady Jane to us? What is the story actually about?
It centers around Jane Grey, who in history, of course, was a teenage girl who was very smart, who somehow, through no fault of her own, ended up on the throne of England for 9. People say 9, some people say 10. There's some contention.
I say 13.
You say 13? Okay.
I say 13. The reason being, if we're being official, it is 13 days, because the monarch, there is never not a monarch. And Jane Grey, the moment Edward VI died, Jane Grey became queen, and that was the 6th of July. It was announced on the 10th. So the 10th is the start. The 10th is the start of the 9 days. So that's when it was proclaimed. But officially, her reign started on the 6th. So I call her the 13 days queen.
Okay, I like that. I can go with that.
Yeah.
And then, just very short, like you say, it didn't last very long. And she was basically kicked off the throne, put in the Tower of London, and then later she was beheaded. And I always thought that was a really terrible ending to someone who I thought was very cool in history. Like, who, when I, studied her and read her writings, I thought she was just kind of an amazing person. And then, who got really a bad ending. And so I wanted to write a story that would give her a better ending and like reimagine her story as something where she had a little bit more agency and was able to save herself. And just, it was just kind of an alternate universe, a fantastical alternate universe. We like to write a fantasy element into all of our books so that it will never be mistaken as actual historical fiction, that there's always something fantastical about the stories. So it's really about Jane's adventure not losing her head. And how that, she finds her own power and gets her own happy ending.
Yeah.
And that's what all of our books do.
So was that the reason why you decided to tell a story with Jane Grey at the centre, essentially the desire to be able to not rewrite history, but write an alternate history, I suppose.
Yeah. And I've loved the story of Jane Grey since I was 16 years old and took a British history class. And it is amazing to me how many women that I meet who have the same experience. The showrunner of the show, Gemma Burgess, same thing. She loved and connected to that story. And just women all over the world, like, hear this story and like are able to read some of her writing and connect with her. I don't know if it's because we're teenagers and she was this teenager at the time or whatever, but I've laughed about her being kind of my Roman Empire. Like, she was a figure that I just thought about regularly for my entire life. Like, I think I read her story when I was about 16. I wrote the novel in my 30s. So like I was thinking about her the entire time. So yeah, it seemed like a natural move to want to write a novel about her and work that story somehow.
Yeah, I mean, she's a fascinating figure from history, and to your point a moment ago, ultimately a very tragic figure. In fact, I've described her before. I think ultimately her story is probably the most tragic story, maybe closely followed by Catherine Howard, because this was a girl who, was just thrown into a position so beyond her control. So intelligent. I mean, it's well documented that she was considered more intelligent than Elizabeth, and that her life was snuffed out at such a young age for essentially something that was very beyond her control is just so sad, isn't it, really? You position Jane as an incredibly headstrong, very capable young woman. She's a bit of a badass. This is in direct contrast to the sort of the more meek and timid Jane that she's generally portrayed as. Now, most historians, myself included, see Jane actually as a much stronger character than we typically see. So firstly, thank you for portraying her in that way. And was that how you always saw Jane as well? So when you sort of went into this, you knew, I want to tell Jane through a position of strength and being very capable and not meek and sort of mild.
Yeah, I think that her strength comes through her writing a little bit. Like, if you read some of the things that she wrote, I think her kind of sass comes through in a way. And I think that's not something that you could really feel in a lot of other writing of that time, but like she seemed like she had a will to her and that you can really see in her writing and also in kind of her decisions along the way. And I think that came through in the book. She never wields a sword in the book the way that she wields a dagger and is really a real true badass in the show. And I like that. I at the beginning, people were complaining a little bit about that. Like people who love the book and don't like when things are changed, and I always
bound to happen.
I always liked that. I mean, I liked that change. It was just sort of an exterior way of showing her strength and her education. Like, they explain it by saying, well, she was educated alongside Edward as he was educated, which is a little bit silly, but but works, and I think I liked their decision to do that. But her using her wit and her intellect and that kind of emotional and intellectual strength was always something that we were really interested in portraying about Jane. And I think that using the sort of the physical is fun in the show too. So
a major aspect of your story is the presence of magic. You have a society which is effectively broken into two core groups. So the Verity, which are people who are totally human, and then you have Ethians who possess the ability to take on an animal form at will. How did you come up with this? Was there a historical reference you used here? Was there something you saw in a book? Where did this come from?
I wish it was a historical reference. I just wanted something to represent the Protestants and the Catholics. Like, right. I don't think you can tell the story of Jane Grey without really talking about these two groups and the tension between them that was happening at the time. But I didn't want to go into the sort of religious element of it. We wanted it to be fantastical. So that the Ethians and the Verities is a replacement of that system. And I think I came up with it just from my love of shows like Lady Hawk. I had an image very early on, before we even got rolling on the story, before I even really knew what it was, of a girl walking alongside a horse, and that same girl, later, a man walking with a mouse in his pocket, and in sort of like that. It was sort of a Lady Hawk situation in which they were together but not human at the same time, and that was something that I was just an image that was sort of a series of images that were staying with me as I was thinking about that, and that worked its way into the development of the Ethians and the Verities and how that went forward.
Couple of questions now about Gifford Dudley, Guilford Dudley, as he's actually called him, the real person. So he's an Ethian. Obviously, he's the young man that is married to Jane Grey. So firstly, I'm just curious why you changed his name to Gifford, and secondly, was there always the plan as well with him that, because he's an Ethian in the book, but he doesn't have the ability to control his change into a horse in the way that other people do. So where did you come up with that idea as well?
I kind of wish we hadn't changed his name. I think, we wrote this back in 2014. As we were making these kind of decisions back then. And I don't think we, as Americans, I don't think we understood quite, how Gifford sounds compared to Guilford. And so I think we wanted to change some things just to say, hey, look, this isn't real history. We're going to change some things. I think it was just that at the time that we just liked the name Gifford better than Guilford, which seems crazy to me now. I'm like, Guilford works just fine. I don't know why we thought that. And we had always planned for him to say, call me G, and to call him G mostly throughout the series. But now I look back on that and I'm like, you should have just left his name alone. It's fine. It works fine. And it was funny when the show people were approaching us about it, and they were like, we're going to go ahead and change it back to Guilford. And we were like, yes, go for it.
Yeah. It's a funny one because of the spelling. It's, as I'm sure you probably know, there's a very big town in the UK called Guildford, and it's spelt exactly the same way. But because the D, the first D is essentially silent, I was listening to an audiobook a while ago, and the narrator clearly didn't know the pronunciation. So throughout this entire book, she said Guildford whenever she spoke about Guilford Dudley, and it was so distracting. So I did think to myself, I wonder if it was a pronunciation thing, given that you're in the US, and maybe, as you the way you read it, wouldn't have married up as such.
Yeah, I think that may have been part of it, that we just didn't want, that we didn't know how it was pronounced properly. Yeah. I had watched Helena Bonham Carter and the, Lady Jane.
Lady Jane.
Yeah, and I remember the way her voice sounded saying his name, and it sounded to me like Gifford even then, I was missing that L when I was hearing it. I think that not knowing what to do with the D was probably part of that reason too at the time.
Nice. And the thing about him being an Ethian who can't control his ability.
What I liked about that, what I wanted for, I think, and we collectively wanted for the main arc of the book, is both of these people really coming into knowing who they are and accepting who they are. And I think in the book, Guilford it's a little bit different in the book than it is in the show. I think in the book, he kind of wants to be a horse during the day. He doesn't hate it the way that Guilford does in the show. It's just sort of a habit for him, and he started doing it when he was a teenager, and it is a way for him to avoid his responsibilities and his role as a man in the society. He would rather be a man at night and be able to sort of have that freedom. So in the book, being an Ethian to Guilford represents freedom, and he can't really choose to do it, but he is sort of subconsciously choosing to do it. And I think that tracks with the show as well. Whereas in the show, they've given him kind of a tragic backstory around it. And I think that works too. I understand why they did that. And So and I love the way in the show that that works out, that arc for him where he has this tragic backstory of him not wanting to accept who he is, and like ethianism being kind of a stand-in for otherness, and he can't choose what he is, and he can't accept it, and he's wanting to be cured of who he is so desperately throughout the show. And I think that works so well in the show. I really love that choice that they made, and I love how it plays out. So I think they did such a great job in working that element for him in the show.
Something that's cut from the TV adaptation is that Jane is herself an ethian. And in your book, she only learns that she can turn into a ferret as she's about to be executed. So, firstly, I'd like to just know how you feel about that being cut, given that she is your main character. And was this also another sort of move, I suppose, from your part to show how your Jane and Guilford are actually really well suited?
I think in my brain anyway, and I don't know that all the Janes agree with this. So like all of our co-authors, and I myself did not write Jane. So like I was actually having a conversation with Jody Meadows about this because Jody wrote Jane's point of view. And we were talking about why Jane turns into a ferret and why she can't control it either at the beginning, because G's is such an easy explanation for us, and we understand it so well. But why isn't Jane able to control it? And we talked about that she does it in her way. Becoming a ferret makes her feel safe too. Like she's able to kind of hide, and she becomes a ferret at night. So it's just a way for her to like feel safer in that moment too. And she learns how to get over that fear much faster than G, right? Like she gets a hold of it much faster than G. But I think in my brain, and this is not canon for the show, so don't quote me here, but in my brain, I feel like this is a world where anyone really could become an ethian, like that they all might have a secret ethian in there. It just might not come out, So like in my brain, any single character could have that animal person show up at any time. And we play around with talking about that in My Lady Jane, and then also in My Contrary Mary, which exists in the same world, about how they all might have that. But I think, and originally Jane's ethian form was supposed to be a mouse. And right. Then as we were writing it, we just kind of felt like she wasn't a mouse. Like it didn't work out that way. And Jody actually had ferrets at the time, and as pets, and loved them. And both Brody and I approached Jody separately, actually, without talking to each other. And we both talked to her and said, maybe Jane's not a mouse. Maybe she's a ferret. Like let's try writing her that way and see how that comes across. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because ferrets are incredibly maligned, as an animal. Like they're not seen as being a positive animal. They're actually outlawed as pets in certain parts of our country. I don't know how it is in Britain, but like they have a very negative, weaselly connotation, and they're actually delightful animals, and never get shown in any kind of media. I think the only time I can remember seeing a ferret is in like the Harry Potter series where they feed ferrets to the griffin, like it's yes. Very small, and I don't know. I can't speak as to why the show made the decisions that they did. I do think that they wanted to downplay the fantasy a little bit and upplay the historical romance of it. So there's not as much of the fantasy in the show as there is in the book. And I don't know if they felt like people couldn't handle Jane becoming a ferret. That's the sort of negatively seen animal. Or how they would have thought of it. I remember I asked the showrunner about it once, and she was like, well, that would be fun. But that wasn't answered like, yeah, that's not going to happen. So I don't know. It didn't upset me. And the reason it didn't upset me was because I felt like they did the Ethian arc with Guilford so well. Like the way that they made it work in the show was so heartfelt and so beautifully done that our version in which, Jane becomes a ferret and like squeezes under the door and that's how they escape, is so much less dramatic and emotional because it's the center of it's the middle of our book. It's not the
Yeah.
end, like it's not. So I felt like the show did it so, so well. And I wouldn't have wanted to see Jane turn into a ferret and slip under the door and them escape that way in the show as they had it. Like it would not have had the same emotional impact and or the cinematic impact.
Yeah.
Gosh, like the ending of the series is so great. So, of this season is so great. So, yeah, I'm happy that they did what they did. And if they make her into a ferret in the future, I will be happy. But if they don't, like I can understand, some of what their reasoning might be.
Yeah. I mean, to answer your question, yes, people have pet ferrets in the UK. Not many. They're not that common. But weirdly, two of my exes have had ferrets, which is random. But yeah, they are allowed to be kept as pets here, but they're not very common in the way that a bunny rabbit would be. But anyway, I digress. A character that I just loved is Lady Frances Grey, so Jane's mother. I mean, in the show, it's Anna Chancellor, so she's obviously, an amazing actress. So funny. She's as a figure, Frances Grey has not had a very good reputation over the years, in large part owing to this belief that she was maybe abusive towards Jane. Your Frances isn't particularly likeable, but she's very amusing, as I say, and in the show, she's hysterical. So was that a deliberate move on your side to sort of bring a bit of humour to this woman?
Yeah, I think in the show she's portrayed much more humorously, and I love that. And I love Anna. And it was funny, we were having the day of the Los Angeles premiere, we went there and we happened to meet Anna at breakfast. And she was just delightful, as you would expect. But she asked us specifically, if we thought that she was really that abusive, like in real life. And I think it's tricky because I think the reason why people say that is because what Jane says, that she's pinched, right? Like that her parents are pinching her and poking at her, and I think, well, okay, that's the reason why she gets that. But as someone who's the mother of a teenage girl, right, because as I am, I'm like, it just seems like that might be a little unfair to like take the word of a teenage girl who's complaining about her mother, and that's going to malign me for the rest of history, so I don't know, like I think, like as to like, was Frances really abusive? I don't know. Probably, the pinching isn't great, but I love how Anna plays her, and she makes some really flawed decisions in the show, and some really dark decisions, and I love that. I love a character who you don't really know what they're going to do. They're a little bit unpredictable, and they're morally gray, and you kind of love them, and I love that dynamic between them in the show, especially. In the book it's there, but I think in the show they highlight it so much, this back and forth and this battle of wills between Frances and Jane, and it just makes for delicious storytelling, and it's played so well.
I mean, a smile is coming to my face when I think about Anna Chant. I mean, that there's the bit where I'm literally spat a drink out. When she's they're at a dinner and Stan sort of says hi, and she just looks and says, "What?" And it's just the delivery is so incredible. I mean, literally spat my drink out because it was so it's the delivery of Anna Chancellor. I just thought it was genius, absolutely genius.
Yeah, she's amazing, and any time that she's on the screen, you just can't look away. Like she's just
a real scene stealer.
What's she gonna do? Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
So another character who's suffered with a poor reputation over time is, of course, Mary Tudor, Princess Mary in the book, and in the show, later Queen Mary I. She's definitely one of the antagonists of the story. So I'm curious to know, was this maybe some of your own feelings about Mary creeping into the story? Where did you come up with Mary's narrative, I guess?
I think in any dramatic telling of the story of Jane Grey, Mary has to be the antagonist. like
Mm.
at least in some form, right? And I do think that's being a little bit unfair to Mary in history. And in
Yeah,
my own
I agree.
discussions with people who are, you know, historians or like people who are just history buffs, I do think that it's being a little bit unfair to Mary. I mean, yes, she's called Bloody Mary, and yes, she made decisions that led to the deaths of people and those sorts of things. But like, it's putting a lens of, a scrutiny on her that if you put it on anyone else, and on Elizabeth and on these people, like they all have to make these decisions and do these things.
And
Right,
did.
right. And
Yeah.
so it's unfair to her to be portrayed as being so bad, but we are talking about a drama here. So like we have to have a
Yeah, of course.
villain. And in the book, I think Dudley is actually more of a villain in some ways than Mary. And I like that they've pulled that back. I love how they've like treated Dudley, and he's just played so charmingly. And like his relationship with Guilford and Stan is so fun in the show. But and Mary, gosh, is just played so incredibly well too. But they've just amped up the villainy of
Yeah.
her so much. She's not as big of a character in the book, largely because the characters escape from Mary's clutches pretty, like halfway through the book, and they have a lot more adventure to go on, and there aren't as many scenes with Mary. And so
Mm.
I think she comes off way more villainous in the show than she does in the book. But I love what they've done with
Yeah.
her.
And insane as well.
Oh yeah, gosh, yeah,
Comes
like
across as in the show, she comes across as just mad. Funny as well. I mean, again, the smiles coming to my face. There's that scene where she sort of goes stomping into a garden and grabs some shears from a guy and says, "Give me those and fuck off." And it's just the delivery again. It's just brilliant. And yes, she's the villain of
yeah,
the piece, but like Anna Chancellor, you can't help but enjoy her when she's on screen. It's Kate Flynn, isn't it? I think is the actress.
yes, and she's
Yeah.
so stupendous. Well, that moment right after that when she eats the rose in front of the guy, like
Mm.
she just the end of the conversation, she just puts it in her mouth. Like it's so bizarre, but she again, you're just like, what is this character gonna do? Like she's so unpredictable, and she's such a good foil to Jane. Gosh, yeah. And the scene where she and Jane sort of like face off in the garden, that scene is crazy, where Jane's like, I have the proof, that you did this. And then she eats it. Like it's crazy. Like she just, yeah, I mean, the energy of those actors and by, making these characters come to life is just so fun for me.
Yeah.
And I wish we'd written more of Mary just watching that happen, like they have such lovely scenes with Mary.
So by contrast, Princess Elizabeth is definitely a more compassionate character. She's portrayed as someone who's quite in tune with nature and magic. She's herself revealed to be an ethian. Was there anything you took from the real Elizabeth when you were creating your interpretation of her character?
Yeah, what I wanted to show with Elizabeth was that she was very smart, but quietly so, like that she needed to survive. I think, at that time, her like main goal would be just to survive, at that.
Mm.
But she also was very sort of commanding. I wanted to give her a little bit more of the sort of commanding presence that I imagine her having later in life, and to see like little glimmers of who she would be later in life in her in those moments. So in the book, she's very calm. She's always about a step ahead of them. Like she always understands the situation and where it's going way before the other characters do. She often beats them to a place. They're like, "Oh, we got to go here," and then when they get there, she's already there. Like she's she's just really smart and present. And I don't think they give that to her as much in the show. I think,
Mm.
and I don't know exactly what they're doing with her in the show. I know that if we get a season 2, that I think a lot of that will be about her growth and where she goes with it. But I really wanted to show Elizabeth as kind of a ghost of her future self, and
Right.
as a teenage girl, because she too, is what she's like 19, and to like show her like little hints of who she will become, so that I loved being, because I wrote Edward's point of view in the show or in the book, and he had a lot of scenes with Elizabeth, and
Mm.
so I was the one who wrote those scenes largely. When Elizabeth was on the page in the book, I wrote those scenes, and that was really what I was going for, was to show this kind of quiet, smart, calculating, but in a, like really efficient way, strong person, who's going to show up in history in a big way.
I always describe Elizabeth's reign as the greatest bit of cosmic karma that has ever happened. The daughter that's essentially resulted in her mother being beheaded goes on to supersede Henry VIII. It's just the best bit of karma, isn't it, ever? I think.
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy to imagine what he would have thought of all of that.
Yeah, when people ask me sometimes if you could go back and ask, or if you could meet someone from history and tell them something, I'll often say I'd love to be able to say to Henry VIII, by the way, it is the man that determines the sex of a child. I think I'd love to see his face. I think that would be a fun one to a little nugget to impart. So, a character I would love to ask you about is Stan Dudley. Where did he come from? Because he's not based on there wasn't a Stan Dudley, at least to the best of my knowledge and belief. Again, he's one of the most
What? You didn't know about this?
There were lots of Dudley boys, but yeah, there wasn't a Stan. So where did he come from? Is he an amalgamation of some of the other Dudley boys put together? Yeah, what was the inspiration for him?
Yeah, very early on, when we were like writing the first chapters, we had a version in which there were like 13 Dudley brothers, right? Like there were just so many, and they all had a G name, and they were all kind of indistinguishable. We didn't really get into the writing of it, but when we were talking about the family structure and all of that, and it was like, at some point we were like, nope, this is way too complicated. There's just too many of them. Let's just make it one guy, And so then we just thought it was funny to call him Stan, and to have him I think in the show, again, I don't want to like downplay the book. I love the book, but like, I think in the show that Stan is so much funnier than he is in the book, like he's kind of he's kind of funny in the book, and he has his moments, but he's not as sort of lovable as Henry Ashton makes him in the show. And he's
an idiot in the show, but in a great way.
Yes, he has such a cool little arc himself, as a character. And I really loved watching him and Rob Brydon together, especially in like the actor who plays Dudley. And yeah, he's lovely. In the book, he is just kind of this person who's always reminding G, what he should be, like he's done all the right things. So like, we were talking about how in the book, G becomes a horse to escape becoming a man. I think Stan is sort of the representation of who that man is, and he doesn't want to be Stan. And so like, I think there are just many key moments in the book where Guilford has to face Stan as a representation of who everyone wants him to be, and in the show, they just make him so fun. His like pink doublet kills me, like just all of it is just so funny.
And as we said a moment ago, his scenes with Anna Chancellor are brilliant, and as are the scenes between Rob Brydon and Anna Chancellor, again, two actors at the top of their field. So it was just brilliant casting all round. We've discussed the fact that this is now a major television series, and so there's a couple of things I would like to find out. So one is, how involved were you in the adaptation? Were there things, were you actively involved throughout? And were there any things that you wished that they hadn't changed? If you're happy to answer that.
Yeah, that's a little tricky to answer that, but we were not involved in the writing at all.
Right.
We do have a relationship with the showrunner, who has been so lovely to us, and who texts us sometimes, and we sort of message her back and forth, and we talk about all sorts of things. We fangirl about moments in history, and we like we cheer her on when she's writing, she cheers us on when we're writing, like, so we have a great relationship with her and have always felt so rooted in the process of the book becoming a show in that way. But we didn't really have any say in any of the things that happened or any of the things that they changed. I love the show. I especially love how it ramps up at the end. And I just, I, like everyone else, was just glued to my seat and kind of laughing and loving it, like the whole way. And there's nothing in it that sort of made me feel sour or bitter that they changed. I understand why they changed the backstories in the way that they did sometimes. As someone who wrote Edward, I feel a little bereft at Edward's story in the show. I wish that he was given more to do that was important and a little bit more agency. I think he is played so well by Jordan Peters. I really loved him in that role. And I think that he really dug down into the book too. I've heard Jordan talk multiple times about how he looked to the book to try to find this character. And of course, as an author, I love to hear that. And as the author who wrote that character, I love to hear that. But like, I can see that in his performance. I can see like him working that out, and his relationship with Jane too, Edward's relationship with Jane. But I wish that he was given more. And I do wish that they had let Edward's ethian form be a thing without giving too much away. More than Jane's, like more than this notion of Jane being a ferret. I think Edward coming to terms with his own ethian form is important to me as a writer. And I wish that that was something that was in the show. So if there was anything that I kind of yearned for as I was watching the show, it was more Edward, and more given for him to do. I felt like he had things to do, but they weren't very essential to the plot of the show. And so I felt like that was a missed opportunity for him.
His sexuality as well is changed in this series, isn't it? Because he's not gay in the book, if I remember right.
No. Although they told me that very early on that they were going to change his race and his sexuality in the show. And I thought, well, that makes sense. I liked both ideas. I really thought that was interesting. As someone who'd done a lot of research on Edward and had been really trying to feel out what it would feel like to be him, I thought, that I could see that. I don't know if you as a historian could see it, but I'm like, I can see Edward with all of his like male friends around him. And to me, he seemed like, just in like reading some of what he wrote, like a little bit suspicious of women overall. Not that, gay people are suspicious of women, but like that his closer friendships and his closer relationships were with men. And, I could see that as being a thing for him in this fictional world.
Yeah.
I don't know. How do you feel about it?
I suppose I would kind of say, actually, I think with Edward, it was more that my reading of Edward is that he was actually quite misogynistic. And once you do a lot of digging into the real story of Edward VI, he had all the hallmarks of, in my opinion, and I know it's the same opinion shared by lots of other historians, he had all the hallmarks of essentially a psychopath. And would have grown to be much more of a tyrant than his father ever was, and would have been just as voracious in burning Catholics as his sister would become with burning Protestants. And that's, I really do believe that Edward was quite misogynistic and just as fervent in his religious conviction as his sister was, but for the Protestant faith rather than Catholicism. I think that's how I would frame Edward. It's a tough one, but I didn't have any issue with him in being gay. I thought that was I actually, I suppose as well, because to your point, he doesn't have there's not much meat on the bone for his character in this show. So I suppose giving him that additional edge to his character maybe is a way of also fleshing him out more in the way that they just wouldn't have been able to do otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we tried to play around with the sexism that Edward shows, I think, in the book. They do it a tiny bit in the show, but I think they're afraid to show any character having what a modern audience would perceive as like a major flaw that way. you know?
Of course.
And yeah, I think you're absolutely right that like it's one thing to take a character and sort of the situation of that character and the real life person, and then kind of draw it toward a modern sensibility, as we did, and want Edward to be to grow. Like in the book, he starts out being very, very sexist and then slowly kind of gets educated, right? And like slowly comes to believe that that women have as much, worth and value in society as men, which I don't think the real Edward would ever have thought. So like,
No, definitely not.
but I think our book is all about, in some ways, and all of our books are all about wishful thinking a little bit when we think of history. And so it's not really about who the people were as much as who we kind of wish they could have been, So I think for me that really comes through with Edward. Is it's kind of how I wish things could have been. It's kind of terrifying to think about him being like a worse tyrant than Henry.
Yeah, but I firmly believe that, and as I say, I've spoken to other historians who share the same belief. But who knows? Who knows? I was going to ask you whether you think there'll be a season 2. You've sort of hinted that it's a possibility. So we'll just wait and see, I guess.
Yeah, we don't know. We just don't know. We have not been told. I know that they really, of course, the showrunners and the writers and all that really want there to be a season 2. And we want it, and the fans want it. But it's a tricky decision from Amazon, and we just haven't. We're just waiting to see.
Well, I mean, it was met with critical acclaim. I think it's got 92% on Rotten Tomatoes. So, like, it should. That alone tells you that it was been very well received and people like it. So, fingers crossed. I'd love to see a season 2 because I adored it. And it's as a historian, I have to, with these types of shows and your book, I know going into it, this is fictional, and sometimes it doesn't work. But with yours, because the story is so bananas in many respects, I think that actually, in a way, makes it easier to get into and enjoy. Whereas something like the other Boleyn Girl, I really struggle with. And so, fingers crossed, we'll see more My Lady Jane, because it was, as I say, I just loved it. So my final question is, I would just like to know what you think the real Jane Grey would make of your book series and the television show.
Oh gosh. I would, of course, to be positive, I think I would say I hope she would appreciate it and like seeing herself be so badass, right? But I don't know. I mean, as we were talking about, in terms of, I think she was quite a serious person, so I can never tell how people are going to like our book until I sort of understand what their sense of humor is, and there's so much silliness in My Lady Jane and in all of our books, and people who don't like silliness tend not to like our book. And the show too, I imagine, so like, to me, it's always a pretty good indicator, of just the silliness threshold that people are willing to endure, of reading our books. And so I don't know how silly she was. I haven't been able to get any sense of that.
I think she was quite serious, quite studious.
So she might be like wildly offended.
Who knows? It's whether she...
But she's okay.
Yeah.
Like, this is not actively hurting her.
She'd probably appreciate the way the arc of Mary's character. I think she'd probably be cool with that. Well, thank you so much for coming on to have a discussion today. This has been really fun, and I've loved getting to hear more about the story. So thank you again for coming on. So where can people find you on X or Instagram?
Yeah, you just have to look up Cynthia Hand. The group of us who wrote the book, who call ourselves the Lady Janies, we also have an Instagram account that's just Lady Janies. And if you want to see more about our books, you just go to ladyjanies.com, and you can pretty much get anywhere, about all of our books. We have a new book coming out this August 20th, which is about Mary Read, the pirate. And it's kind of a retelling of The Little Mermaid. That's the fantastical element. And then Mary Read the pirate together. So that's fun. And yeah, we're just thank you so much for having me. I had such a great time talking about it, and I wish you the best.
Thank you very much. You're very welcome, and we'll speak soon. And so that brings me to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. My thanks to Cynthia for coming onto the show and discussing the My Lady Jane series with me. If you enjoy the podcast, then please do leave a review. And if you would like to access more content from the Tudor Chest, then perhaps you would consider becoming an official patron on my Patreon account, where I release additional weekly bonus subscriber episodes. My thanks to my latest patrons, Lucy Crouch, Rachel Tillard, and Christina Larkin. If you have any suggestions for future podcast episodes, please do get in touch. I would love to hear from you. Thank you again for listening to the show, and speak soon.